Tommy Cruise had always heard stories about chupacabras from his father. He never believed them. But 3 months ago, his father passed away, leaving behind 300 pages of notes. The notes described the chupacabra in great detail. They also had a map showing a hidden forest in Kansas. Tommy couldn't ignore it. He packed his gear and set out on the journey. His father's notes were detailed. They described strange sightings and unexplained disappearances. The stories had always seemed like myths, but the notes made them feel real. Tommy spent weeks studying them before setting out. He didn't know what he would find, but he had to see for himself. It took him 2 months to reach the forest. The road was long and he passed through many empty towns. The closer he got, the quieter everything became. When he arrived, the forest stretched out before him. It was unlike any forest he had seen. The trees were huge, their thick branches blocking out the sun. The ground was covered in tangled roots and fallen leaves. The air smelled damp and heavy. It was eerily silent. Tommy adjusted his backpack and stepped forward. He didn't stop to rest. He walked for 6 hours, stepping carefully over uneven ground. His father's map guided him deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around him. He had never been somewhere so quiet. Even his own footsteps felt too loud. After hours of walking, he saw something strange through the trees. An old, abandoned building stood in the middle of the forest. A tall metal fence surrounded it, rusted and bent in places. The building looked old, like it had been left to decay for years. Its walls were cracked, and vines crawled up the sides. The windows were broken, and the entrance looked dark and unwelcoming. Tommy's heart pounded. He knew this place was important. His father's notes mentioned an old structure deep in the woods. This had to be it. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and moved forward. The fence was tall, but he climbed over it with ease. His boots hit the ground on the other side. He looked around, taking in the eerie silence. There was no wind, no birds, no movement. Everything was still. The feeling in his stomach grew heavier. As he walked toward the entrance, something changed. The sky suddenly darkened. He looked up and saw thick clouds covering the sun. The temperature seemed to drop. A strange tension filled the air. His instincts told him to turn back, but he had come too far. He had to see what was inside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tried to check the time, but there was no signal. He frowned and checked his other equipment. Everything was fine, but still, nothing worked. He switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The building smelled old and damp. The walls had cracks and dust covered the floor. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. The place had been abandoned for a long time. Each step Tommy took made a soft crunch on the floor. He shined his flashlight around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. As he looked around, something caught his eye. On the wall, someone had scratched words into the surface. It read, "Escape before it's too late." A chill ran down his spine. Who had written this, and why? The letters were uneven and deep, as if they had been made in a hurry. His hands trembled as he backed away. His heartbeat grew faster. He felt the urge to leave immediately. He turned toward the exit, ready to leave. His instinct screamed at him to run. Then a loud roar shook the building. It came from deep inside the halls. The sound was not human. It was deep and guttural, like something ancient and angry. The walls seemed to vibrate from the force of it. Tommy froze. His breathing became shallow. His flashlight flickered slightly. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead. He swallowed hard and slowly turned around. 2 glowing eyes stared at him from the darkness. They were bright yellow, unblinking. The creature stepped forward, its long claws clicking against the floor. It had thin limbs, sharp fangs, and dark, leathery skin. It was real. It was a chupacabra. Tommy's mind went blank. He couldn't move. He had spent months chasing this legend, but now it stood in front of him, and it was terrifying. Panic took over. His body reacted before his mind could. He turned and ran. His boots pounded against the dusty floor as he sprinted to the nearest room. He threw himself inside and slammed the door shut. His chest heaved as he locked it. He pressed his back against the wall, gripping his flashlight tightly. His hands were shaking. The creature let out a growl. It was low and menacing. Then it started scratching at the door. The sound of its claws digging into the wood made Tommy's skin crawl. Each scrape was slow and deliberate, like it was toying with him. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. The creature breathed heavily on the other side. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. He glanced around the room. It was small and empty. There were no windows, no other doors. He had no escape. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He thought about his father's notes. Nothing had prepared him for this. He had found the truth. But now, he was trapped. Tommy stayed in the room for 3 days. He had no food, no way to call for help. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the creature outside. Sometimes it scratched the door. Other times, it let out low growls. The sound sent chills down his spine. He sat in the corner, hugging his knees. His stomach growled and his mouth felt dry. He tried not to think about food, but the hunger was too strong. He had never gone this long without eating. His body felt weak, but fear kept him frozen in place. He thought about his father's notes. His father had written that the Chupacabra hunted at night. But Tommy didn't know if that was true. Maybe it was waiting for him to come out. Maybe it was always watching. His thoughts raced. He couldn't stay here forever. If he didn't leave now, he might die in this room. He had to take the risk. On the 3rd day, he made a choice. He took a deep breath and grabbed his flashlight. His hands shook as he listened carefully. The creature was not making any noise. Maybe it had left. With shaking hands, he unlocked the door. He didn't look back. He just ran. Tommy sprinted through the hallways. His flashlight flickered as he ran. His heart pounded in his chest. He expected to feel claws tearing into his back at any second. He could almost hear the creature behind him, but nothing happened. He reached the front door, pushed it open, and bolted outside. The cold air hit his face, but he didn't stop. He ran toward the fence, jumping over it as fast as he could. The forest was dark and silent. Every shadow looked like the creature. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't slow down. Branches scraped against his arms as he ran through the trees. He kept going, refusing to look back. His only goal was to reach his car. His breathing was ragged, but he pushed forward. Finally, he saw it. His car was right where he had left it. He ran faster, fumbling for his keys. He jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. His hands were shaking as he started the engine. He sped away, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Only when he was miles away did he start to believe he was safe. That night, he ate his first meal in days. He could hardly believe he had survived. The creature had been real. The stories were true. He had proof on his camera. He had to show someone. The next morning, he met his friend, a police officer. He told him everything. At first, his friend didn't believe him. But when Tommy showed him the footage, the officer's face changed. They had to go back. Tommy and a group of officers drove back to the forest. The drive felt longer this time. Tommy's hands were sweaty. He knew what he had seen. He knew what had chased him. But when they arrived, everything was gone. The building? Gone. The fence? Gone. The scratches on the door? Gone. There was nothing but an empty clearing. No sign that anything had ever been there. The officers looked around, confused. "Are you sure this is the place?" one of them asked. Tommy's heart sank. He had recorded everything. But now, even his camera was blank. No footage, no proof. Had he imagined it? He knew what he had seen. But no one else ever would.